communion with my Lord, hearing His voice in every line, making each faithful saying mine. More about Jesus, more about Jesus, more of His saving fullness see, more of His love who died for me.
So in the first part of this topic, we covered about what is there such thing as true worship? And we've concluded that there is, according to Jesus, a correct way, a true way to worship God, to worship Him in truth. Now we need to worship Him in spirit as well, but it has to be according to truth. And how do we know how that true way to worship God is? Well, the Holy Spirit gave that teaching to the apostles, and the apostles wrote it for the church here in our Bibles, in the New Testament. And so we need to study how the apostles taught to worship God. But carrying on this topic of Easter, what do you mean by celebrate? Because we want to cover, is it okay to celebrate traditions such as Christmas, Easter, these sorts of things? And it depends what you mean by celebrate. Do you mean strictly as a tradition for the family? Or do you mean you are involving it as worship? Well, as worship, we want to make our worship look like New Testament worship, how the apostles taught us to do that, because that's how the Holy Spirit wanted us to do it. And so now we want to continue picking up on that. Now, first and foremost, since it is Easter Sunday, a day that the world recognizes as the resurrection day of Jesus, and a lot of talk about Good Friday, which is recognized as the day that Jesus was crucified. Excuse me. So we want to start by looking at, do we know when Jesus was in fact crucified? Was it on a Friday? Was it on Good Friday? And is it exactly as we've heard that church tradition? Well, let's start then in the book of Leviticus. And we want to look in Leviticus chapter 24. How do we know when Jesus was crucified? We know because it happened during the Passover. And the Bible tells us when the Passover occurred. And so by looking at the Passover, that's how we know when the crucifixion of Jesus happened. So anyways, though, I think there's a part to that a lot of people may miss. So let's look at the book of Leviticus. I may have said chapter 24, but we want to look at chapter 23. And look here in chapter 23 and verse 5. He says, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight is the Passover of the Lord. Now, obviously, our first month is January. So that's not the same as the first Jewish month. And so the first Jewish month would line up with around April. Sometimes a little sooner. And he says on the 14th day, that is the Passover of the Lord, talking about that meal. They celebrated that meal because of the 10 plagues that happened in Egypt. And Pharaoh said, let my people go. And God, through Moses, led the people out of Egyptian slavery and parted the Red Sea so that they could escape and be free and be given their own land. And so they celebrated that Passover meal to celebrate all of that. But they were told to do this on the 14th day. But then you have verse 6. Then on the 15th day of the same month, there's the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. So he's no longer talking about that 14th day where the Passover meal would happen. Now he's talking about the 7 days, which begins the feast of unleavened bread. And he says in that first day of the 7 days, there in verse 7, on the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work. But for 7 days you shall bring near an offering by fire to the Lord. On the 7th day is a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work. So on the 14th, he's very clear on this. On the 14th is the Passover meal. But on the 15th, that starts the 7 days of unleavened bread. And on that first day, which is on the 15th, no longer the 14th, but the 15th, that is a Sabbath. That's a Sabbath day. And then the 7th day, 7 days later, that is another Sabbath day, meaning don't do any work. And so what we need to understand is we usually recognize that Jesus was crucified about the time of the Passover. There's discussion on that. But there was always a Sabbath day after the Passover. And so just because we find out in the Gospels that the Passover was followed by the Sabbath, that doesn't mean that it was on Friday, because there was always a Sabbath day following the Passover. And this lines up with the Gospel of John. But before we turn to John, let's look at Luke chapter 22. If you'll join me in Luke chapter 22, and we have a very important statement, because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you can see that they say that Jesus, during the Last Supper, which was the night before he was crucified, that Last Supper was the Passover meal. But in John, he refers to the Passover, and he says that Jesus was crucified on the day of the Passover. And so some people have said they contradict each other. But really what we're going to see is that they don't. And the answer is, what do they mean by the Passover? Because examine for us Luke chapter 22, and look at this statement here. Luke 22, verse 1, "Now the feast of unleavened bread, which is called the Passover, was drawing near." In other words, when they said Passover, they're not referring to the Passover meal. They're referring to that entire week of 7 days. The 7 days of unleavened bread. They're referring to that entire week. And they're just calling it the Passover. So they're not talking about that meal that was on the 14th day. They're talking about all 8 days. And so in John, when he refers to the Passover, we got to remember that he's not using that to say that meal. He's referring to that entire week. And we'll see this in John. Let's turn over to John chapter 19. When we look at John chapter 19, look there at verse 14. It says, "Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, 'Behold your king.'" Now the word "for" in the original Greek is not there. It's just translated something like the Passover preparation day. So you got to translate it into English, and it's implied. And so it's the preparation for the Passover. But again, the Passover is not referring to that meal on the 14th day. It's referring to the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, so on and so forth. It's referring to that entire week. Because as we saw in Luke, the Feast of Unleavened Bread is called the Passover. And so it was the preparation day during the Passover, is how you would say it. And so what does he mean by that? Well, you keep on reading, and let's jump down there to still in John chapter 19, but this time we'll look at verse 31. And it says, "Then the Jews, because it was the day of preparation, so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away." So they didn't want them to remain on the cross because they're not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath, and so they take them down that day. And even in verse 42, he says, "Therefore, because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there." In other words, John can't be saying that Jesus was crucified on the Passover, the day of the Passover meal, because he's even saying the Sabbath was the next day. And so he's not contradicting Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He's just referring to that week as the Passover, referring to all 7 days. And so the fact of the matter is, he's very clear in these verses, there in verse 31 and verse 42, that it was the preparation day of the Passover. They're preparing for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was the next day. But remember Leviticus chapter 23, that there was always a Sabbath after the Passover. And so it didn't have to be Saturday. That was the next day. Because any time there was a Passover, the day after it, the 15th day, was supposed to be a Passover. Do no work, he said in Leviticus chapter 23. And so the crucifixion day, a lot of people don't realize, it could have been on Wednesday, it could have been on Thursday, Friday, could have been on Tuesday. We don't know what day that it landed on. And so there's no way to be sure that it was on Friday. In fact, it probably wasn't, because Jesus said that just like Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so the Son of Man himself would spend 3 days and 3 nights inside the heart of the earth. Well, if he's crucified on Friday, you only got Saturday and you got Sunday, there's no way you're getting to 3 days and 3 nights. But you can't be sure about it. And so either way you look at it, we don't know what day that it landed on. Okay? So we start with that. And next, we want to look at what the apostles taught worship is. When we look at what they taught the church is correct worship to God, then we can ask the question, how do we deal with traditions? Okay, if the apostles tell us what worship is, we need to follow that example and do that. And once we do that, are we still allowed to celebrate tradition? Are we still allowed to treat it as worship? And so then when we understand those questions, we will have a good understanding about how to treat holidays such as Christmas and Easter. And so there's very clear instructions on it. So please join us for the next video. That will be the conclusion of this topic. Hope you can join us, but glad you joined us for this one if you made it this far.